or needs to make up a session, we will provide the recording to you. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. I want to thank each of you for supporting our organization and helping us fulfill our education mission by joining this 4-part series on historic properties for realtors in the Bay Area. As Pacific Union agents, you have the exclusive opportunity to be the first agents in our real estate certification program. Though this may be your first foray into the formal historic preservation training, we hope you will continue to be involved with us after the completion of this series. With your registration, you will receive 1 year of membership to the California Preservation Foundation. And we hope that you will make use of this, which will entitle you to discounted registration for over 24 online programs and 12 workshops at historic locations across the state. Today's session will first look at different styles of designation in the Bay Area, different levels of designation in the Bay Area. We will follow that with a presentation of state-level and national designations and their impact on the value, marketability, and tax benefits of historic properties. You will learn why knowing a property's designation is important for agents, how to determine whether a resource is listed as a local, state, or national resource, how to determine if a property is contributing to a designated district, how to examine historic properties in select cities throughout the Bay Area, the differences and implications of designation, both for financial incentives and design regulations. The session's format will consist of 4 speakers, and together it will total for over an hour in length. We will close with a 15-minute question and answer period. On the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side is a comment box. You can make use of that comment box to ask any questions or comment at any time during the presentation. Please note everybody can see your comments, including the other attendees. If you are connected on a mobile device using the Adobe Connect mobile app, certain interactive features may not be available to you, but you should still be able to watch and listen to the presentation. If you're attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen. Once your hand is raised, we will grant you voice access at an appropriate time, and this will allow you to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask a question in person. If for some reason your sound does not work, or you will need to type in your question or response in the chat box. First, I'm going to introduce today's speakers. Roberta Deering oversees the City of Sacramento's Certified Local Government Preservation Program, including staff support to the city's Preservation Commission, Preservation Project and Environmental Review, Historic Resources Survey, Nomination, and Incentives programs, including the Historic Places Fund, to provide matching grant assistance for private historic rehabilitation projects. She also serves as the executive staff for Sacramento Heritage Incorporated, a public-private nonprofit organization chartered by the city. Currently, she serves on the city's River District Technical Advisory Committee, developing a new specific plan, a special planning district, design guidelines, and the designation of 9 new landmarks and a new industrial warehouse historic district for a 773-acre area north of downtown Sacramento. Roberta has over 30 years of experience in historic preservation planning, public policy, advocacy, fundraising, consulting, training, and management. She has worked in the public and private nonprofit sectors, serving as the executive director of this very organization, the California Preservation Foundation, and also as the director of the Chicago office of the State of Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, among other positions. Roberta holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of California, Davis, and a Master's of Urban Planning from the University of Oregon. Caitlin Harvey is an architectural historian with a background in practical preservation methods, as well as historical research and writing. After completing a master's degree in historic preservation at the University of Oregon, she has spent the last 9 years taking the lead on a wide variety of projects, including the survey of Napa, the city of Napa. Betty Marvin is an Oakland historian and city planner responsible for the Oakland Cultural Heritage Survey, The city's study has surveyed every visible building in Oakland and rated them A to D for historical importance. She is also known for her work with the Oakland Heritage Alliance walking tours, the Oakland Heritage Alliance, and most famously for her amazing impression of Julia Morgan. She has a wealth of knowledge about Oakland history and particularly about Miss Morgan. William Berg is the state historian for the California, or is a state historian for the California Office of Historic Preservation. He was born in Skokie, Illinois, and grew up in Sacramento suburbs, attending Humboldt State University, and eventually earning an MA from Sacramento State University's Public History program. Mr. Berg has authored 6 books about Sacramento history. As president of the Sacramento Old City Association, he advocates for the protection of Sacramento's irreplaceable historic resources. So without further ado, I'm first going to mute everybody currently in the room, and I will follow that with by introducing Ms. Roberta Deering. Okay, Roberta, you're ready to begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a little disconcerting seeing this microphone and camera thing and not seeing you, but hello. And I understand most of you are brokers in residential property, and my slides will have a few things that aren't necessarily residential, but it'll give you an overview. Jonathan asked me to go over sort of a wide variety of questions and issues. And the first one was, how does designation impact the incentives and regulations for a property? And in terms of incentives, it's slightly different depending on which level of designation you have, although most of them can cover most things at the local level. If property is listed at the National Register at the national level, it's eligible for the 20% historic rehabilitation tax credits if it's an income-producing property. And William Berg, will be probably getting into that a little bit more later. There's also a preservation easement charitable contribution deduction. It's not as used quite as often, but that can be very helpful in making the numbers work on a historic properties rehabilitation project. The California Preservation Foundation holds at least 2, maybe more easements. The Thorson House in Berkeley is the one that I worked on when I was there. The California, at the state level, the California Historical Building Code is one of the most effective incentives that we use here in Sacramento. It could really help save money as well as historic features and characteristics of the property. This is something that you use working with the local building official through your building plan check permitting process. And it allows a certain flexibility in the regular building code issues, including structural, fire, life safety, Title 24 energy requirements, ADA accessibility. Still must have a safe building, but how you do it, there's more flexibility. Mills Act agreements, and I know Betty and others will talk about that, but that is an agreement the state allows relative to between the local government and the property owner, usually in return for rehabbing their property. There's a potential for a property tax valuation reduction. There's also future, and maybe William Berg will get into this one too. There was a wonderful effort just this last session of the legislature, passed both the Senate and the Assembly unanimously, but the governor vetoed a rehabilitation tax credit at the state level. So hopefully that'll be coming back next session. In local incentive programs, there are usually a variety of programs, and you should check with your local planning departments. Here in Sacramento, we have some zoning incentives, land use density incentives. If you're preserving a landmark, you can have a slightly higher densities in the building than you would normally. Many cities have rehabilitation grants and loan programs, not as much as there used to be with the redevelopment agencies gone now, but there are still a few little dollars around. And impact fee waivers, the River District Special Planning District that Jonathan mentioned I've been working on, is there are some waivers for historic landmark properties if you're adaptively reusing the property and it would have otherwise triggered an impact fee. So those can be very helpful. And on to, oops, there we go, for the how designation impacts regulations of a property. If a property is listed in the National Register and there's a project involving federal funding or federal permitting, Corps of Engineers, FHA, FHWA, all those acronyms, HUD, they go through, it's Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. It's a review just to make sure that properties that are listed and are eligible for listing in the National Register are not negatively impacted by the project. And they try to work out a way to minimize or eliminate the impacts. And that's sort of a NEPA process is usually part of that as well. At the state level, the California Environmental Quality Act, if a property is listed in one of these registers, National Register, California Local Register, you know that it's considered a historic resource for CEQA purposes. And so if you have a project that involves discretionary review, then the element of the environment that could potentially be impacted by your project would be a historic resource. And so you look at ways to avoid the impact using the Secretary of the Interior standards. And that's something that all levels of government use those same standards. And the Historical Building Code, if a property is listed in one of these registers, official register or an officially adopted surveys, then the building official knows that they can use the Historical Building Code. These are more for regulating the government reviewer kind of thing. At the local level, usually the preservation regulations involve the conditioning of the planning entitlements before you can get your building permit or before you can apply for your building permit or your demolition permit. Here in Sacramento, we look at alterations, additions, demolitions, moves, new construction, new uses, step backs, setbacks, all those good things relative to a listed property. There also are minimum maintenance requirements on many local governments have these kinds of things. Most of these issues I mentioned for the 106 reviews, but it's similar to all of them. You don't necessarily have to be a designated property, a listed property, if it's found to be eligible. And under the California Environmental Quality Act, the lead agency, the public agency, the project decision is the decision maker up for the project. They are required to determine whether a property is a historic resource eligible for listing in the California Register, those kinds of things. The next question involves the general criteria for local designations. Throughout California, especially if the local government is what we call a certified local government, and those are programs, historic preservation programs that the State Preservation Office and the federal government, the federal National Park Service's preservation programs. We work all in concert. We work together. The standards we use are the same, and including the eligibility criteria are generally the same. Ours are similar to the California Register, similar to the National Register. We have our few little differences, but it's generally a property in most of the state has to be 50 years old or older. The California Register isn't quite as strict about that, and the National Register also does have special considerations if a property is not quite 50 years old yet. But that's a base. That's not the only thing that is a criteria for being designated a historic property. It also then must be associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the history of your area or the lives of persons significant in your city's past. Or the next three bullets in the National Register criteria are all sort of one criteria embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, of method of construction, represents the work of a master, possesses high artistic values. And then the bullet under that, yielded or may be likely to yield information important to the prehistory or history of the city. This is generally what's used more for the archaeological resources, the cultural resources. And in all these registers, local, state, national, the property has to have historic integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, and association. There's another one in the National Register and California Register, but I'll let them get into that other one. And that's meaning if the property has been so severely altered, changed, that you wouldn't recognize it based on what its era of significance was, it just won't make it. And in Sacramento, you can have a building that's a distinctive characteristic of a craftsman house, but if it's not significant, and this is very open to interpretation, it doesn't have architectural worth, and the designation isn't necessarily going to promote the goals of the historic preservation chapter of the city code. So those are those sort of hard ones to get to. Jonathan also asked me if you can remove designation for a property, and many cities do have a delisting process. Generally, in Sacramento, I've never had anyone apply yet. Knock on wood. I had someone come in, an architect come in for a client asking how to delist their building. I gave him the application form and went through the process, and I haven't heard back from him again, and it's been about a year, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed. But really, it's essentially that the property no longer meets the eligibility criteria, and that had loss of integrity, and that loss of integrity was not the result of an illegal act or a willful neglect by the property owner. Also, there is a way to pursue demolition of a property. Generally, the criteria we have here in Sacramento is if a building perhaps just is not able to be rehabilitated feasibly. The picture of Globe Mills I use here, this was a success story, but it almost didn't get listed because of the loss of integrity after a major fire. And then it also almost didn't get rehabilitated and almost got demolished because the feasibility, economic and technological, dealing with big concrete silos, almost didn't happen without a lot of redevelopment money. And I think low-income housing tax credits, a variety of types of things went into this project. So that there is a way to remove a property's listing. And Jonathan asked me for examples of locally designated properties. And I just wanted, even though I know most of you are in residential real estate sales and brokerage, but a historic property can be more than a house. We have an old warehouse, the Pipe Works. This is part of our river district, our landmark designation in the river district. It's now a fitness center with a big rock climbing wall inside, and just great stuff. And bridges and landscapes, historic districts that are landscapes. So a variety of types of things. Of course, the majority of our historic properties are houses. Jonathan asked me to respond to this question: how to determine whether a property is listed as local, state, or national registers. And we try to have properties listed at all levels. Even the National Register allows a property to be listed even if it's only significant at the local level of significance. But these two churches are a good example of. The one on the right, Shiloh Baptist Church, was designed by Sacramento's first licensed African-American architect, James Dodd. He became a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and the Shiloh Baptist Church board is very, very proud and very, very good with their maintenance, and they have really maintained this. We have excellent documentation that James Dodd was involved in this design. He designed the church, and this is listed at the local, state, and national levels. It is designated in all of the registers. The little building on the left is the Kyle's Temple Zion AME Church. We know the architect. It was a local firm, and the board member who was there when it was built in the late 50s, was opened in 1961. She knew James Dodd and knew he worked on it, but we have nothing that attributes anything to the design to him, except for the fact that it has his fingerprints all over it. He liked diamonds and triangles and all sorts of playing with windows. So the one on the right, the Shiloh Baptist Church, National Register listing for sure. Locally, the Kyle's Temple AME Church. We're going to be pursuing its nomination. The church board has submitted an application for nomination of the church, and so it'll be a Sacramento registered nomination. But I doubt if it would be able to make it onto the National Register. We just don't have enough information that really documents that. So that could be one of the differences. And William Berg probably will talk a little bit more about some of the other differences too. And how to determine if a property is included in a historic district. This gets a lot more involved. In Sacramento, we have criteria that does reference historic districts as a geographically defined area. There are multiple property districts that don't necessarily have to be geographically related. But in Sacramento, this is generally what our historic districts look at. There's a concentration of buildings. This is an old ordinance, and so we've got to update it. So it's not just buildings. It could be structures or landscape features or other things as well. But they're unified by some event or aesthetically in their development. the Historic City Cemetery here is a local historic district, and thanks to Mr. Berg and the State Historic Resources Commission, it's being nominated to the National Register. So we're awaiting that decision by the keeper of the register. The historic districts also still have to go through that integrity consideration, design, setting, materials, workmanship, and association. That associate for historic districts, that association consideration is really key. And then the workmanship and other integrity issues will relate to whether there are contributing resources to the district, they contribute to the reason the district is established, or non-contributing resources. And when you have enough contributing resources and enough of a concentration that it makes sense to be able to identify your district boundaries based on whatever that historic context is that the district is being considered. You know, what about it? How did it begin? What types of architectural styles or historical development patterns does it relate to? What's that historic context? And finally, I was asked to talk a little bit about mapping and examining where historic properties are in your local city. Many cities on their websites will have their historic district boundary maps. This is the one on the right is ours here in Sacramento. These are the locally designated districts. It doesn't necessarily mean there aren't historic districts elsewhere that haven't been surveyed. And on the left, the little color drawing is the Sacramento City Association's consultant was working on developing a new nomination for a new historic district, Newton Booth Historic District in Sacramento, and we're taking that forward now as we speak. And this is just an early sort of, what are the contributing resources? What are the non-contributing resources? What are the landmark resources? You know, what are the vacant lots? Those kind of things. And is there enough of a concentration, and how to draw that boundary line? So those are very subjective things. You have to, you know, have worked with this quite a bit, and it can involve quite a lot of work and time and effort in public hearings. And we have a process in Sacramento for applications for nominations. The preservation director has a hearing to determine eligibility and forwards it to the Preservation Commission for public hearing. They make a recommendation to the City Council, which adopts an ordinance listing a property. So the National Register, the California Register districts aren't necessarily the same boundaries. Our Newton Booth Historic District, our Boulevard Park Historic District, the City Historic District boundaries are different than the National Register Historic District boundaries. Similarly, other of our National Register districts have slightly different boundaries. It's just how things were reviewed and evaluated at the time. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Roberta. I just wanted to also open it up to questions at this point, since Roberta will have to leave early for another meeting. So if anybody has any questions, I ask that you either click the raise hand symbol or type in your question in the chat box. I'll try to keep an eye on it as we're moving forward with the rest of the presentation. Roberta is going to be here not very much longer. She has to make a meeting at 3:30, so you have to ask your questions of her right now. So moving on to the next portion of this presentation, the California Preservation Foundation did somewhat of an exhaustive research effort to figure out what the local designation programs were in communities in which Pacific Union operates. or has real estate offices in. So what I'll do is briefly go over these with one caveat, and that is that we're not experts in your local area. What you need to do ultimately is talk to your planners or talk to your local historical societies and figure out which properties in your city are designated, or any cities in which you're selling real estate. Roberta briefly went over the different types of designation, and William Berg will talk more about it, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But really what I'm going to be really talking about is the local historic preservation programs for a number of cities. For realtors, the reason designation is important is specifically in regards to incentives, is a lot of these cities have Mills Act programs in place which allow property owners to take a standard deduction from their taxes or save money on property taxes. There's also the incentive of the State Historical Building Code, which has more flexible sort of interpretation of building code laws, whether it's structural or accessibility or other types of building code laws. And then also these local historic preservation ordinances provide a measure of protection for these structures, but sometimes they also provide other types of grants or incentives or more streamlined sort of consideration when it comes to different types of permits. Really, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to ask your city's planning department if the city has a preservation ordinance. And if they do, you should also follow up and ask if there's a demolition delay or demolition denial, whether there's a design review program in place, whether the designation program is active or it's kind of become defunct, what kind of benefits are available for historically designated properties, and what kind of staff is in place to sort of address your questions. You won't be able to see this right now. I understand a lot of this text is small, but the reason why we've included it is because we'll provide it to you as a download, and it lists all the different important pieces of information for each of these cities that Pacific Union operates in. So it will tell you whether there's a Mills Act program in place for that city. It'll often have a link to more details about the Mills Act program. It'll tell you whether the city is a certified local government, which qualifies the city for grants and other types of, and also indicates that the city is a strong supporter of preservation. And it will also tell you whether there's a commission in place. That will be a helpful download for you later. And then going into each of these cities, I noticed that most of the realtors in the room right now are from Mill Valley. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're selling properties in Mill Valley, but to give you a brief overview of Mill Valley, they have a list of historic structures. There's a zone, overlay zone for historic properties. We're going to provide you with a map. Most of these links in this presentation are clickable, so you can click on that. It'll show you exactly where these designated properties are in the zone. So I will point you to the design handbook on page 19, which really tells you the implications of what designation means in Mill Valley. And you can also look at the list to see which streets sort of contain those properties. Showing you a quick slide of sort of a heat map exactly where these properties are. You'll see that they sort of follow the spine of the Arroyo Corte Madera and the Old Mill Creek. So there's a very concentrated area. This often happens with historic properties, as they're in very specific areas of the city. And if you know exactly where they are, you can sort of keep them on your radar if any properties that you're listing are within that zone, so to speak. So that's another map, same map, but just showing each of the properties. Of course, the links will point you to more of an interactive version of these maps. A few examples of different properties in Mill Valley that are designated under that overlay zone. You'll notice that they have different architectural styles. A lot of them are residential, which really differs from Larkspur. So Larkspur, the majority of the properties in Larkspur are mainly commercial properties on the main sort of spine downtown. So you'll see this cluster of properties in Larkspur. This is the official designated list of properties in Larkspur. So you'll see exactly where those properties are clustered, and most of them are downtown commercial buildings, but that doesn't necessarily mean that some of these residential properties won't be designated. So there's a list. We'll provide you with a list. Few more examples. You'll see that Magnolia Avenue is a big section of Larkspur that has designated properties, and a few other examples of some residential structures. I'm going to turn this over to Napa, and Caitlin Harvey, who's present here, can sort of briefly talk about how designation works in Napa. Are you there, Caitlin?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I can talk briefly about Napa. I did some survey work there. I was trying to just remember how long ago that was. It was quite a while. And it helped to add quite a few properties to what Napa calls the Historic Resource Inventory, or their HRI. And that's a basic list of properties that they have on their radar as being potentially significant. And I think in a lot of cases there has been some significance identified, but in other cases it's just the fact that these buildings are 50 years or older. And I also do a lot of work in San Francisco, and that's the way it works there too. If a building is 50 years or older, there's sort of a red flag on it, and then that becomes a property that planning is going to want to look at if there's any kind of project proposed that will affect the property. So the HRI is not necessarily an official designation as far as it being on a register or anything, but it is a local list of properties that are noted, or they're on the city's radar. So I think as realtors, it's probably important to realize whether a property may or may not be on that list, and what could potentially be done with the building, what would be appropriate or acceptable to do with it, should the new owners want to do something, undertake a project. Then they also have the landmark properties, which are designated on a local register of landmarks. And so that, it plays into kind of what Roberto and John were both talking about with having a list of designated structures. And those, have been evaluated, and they have met one of 5 criteria in Napa. I think one thing I was going to say is a lot of different cities they all generally follow the National Register criteria, the 4 criteria, but a lot of them will elaborate on them or kind of take liberties to expound upon those criteria. So Napa has 5. Whether it's it represents a special element of history, whether it's associated with people, whether it's associated with architecture. Then they break out architect and builder, and then they have a 5th one that's for whether it's a few or last remaining, if there's few left, or if it's a last remaining example of a specific type of architecture. So there's it's a little more nuanced than the National Register criteria, but it will meet one of those 5 and is considered to be a local historic resource. And then they have conservation properties and areas also. I guess they also have landmark districts, which properties within a district would be considered, if it's a contributor, it would be considered to be a resource as well. Their conservation properties and areas also have various criteria that they need to meet, but it's interesting that it's not necessarily an issue of historic significance, just that they uphold the character of the area, which often ties into historic themes and appearances and character, physical character. So that would be interesting to know too, if you had a property in a conservation area, or if you were considered to be a conservation property, There might be additional review you would have to go through should your buyer or whoever want to do a project. So that kind of covers Napa, I think.
Great, thank you. I don't see any questions rolling in, so if Roberta, if you need to leave at any time, feel free. But it'd be great to have you as long as we can. So with Sonoma, briefly to go over Sonoma, it doesn't have a very active preservation program, the city itself, but the county does. The city does have a historic overlay zone. They adopted a resolution in 2006 to establish an inventory, and the county also experimented. I think it had a 2-year pilot program for the Mills Act, but my understanding is that hasn't been continued. And we'll talk more about the Mills Act and the incentives portion of this series. But there are about 173 landmarks designated in Sonoma County. We're going to provide you with the list, and it might also be helpful to look at the Sonoma Municipal Code for Historic Preservation. And of course, at the top, there's contacts listed for Sonoma, both the city and county. So if you have any questions in regards to Sonoma, you can always contact them. So we sort of talked about the Mills Act, and I won't really go too much into it because it'll very exhaustively be covered in part 4 of the series, but it is probably the best incentive for residential property owners in the state of California who own historic properties. So it's an important incentive, and it's a good selling point for a historic property to tell buyers, you could potentially take advantage of this tax benefit for your property. For Mills Act programs, Berkeley, Burlingame, Danville, Larkspur, Napa Valley, Oakland, and Tiburon Belvedere all have Mills Act programs in place. Some of them are more active than others, and it's always best to contact the local Mills Act contact in your city to learn how to take advantage of those. So I won't go over this other than to say that designation also sometimes has to follow standards for design, and in a certified local government, you sometimes have to get a certificate of appropriateness issued to show that any design changes meet the standards or meet the design, regulations in place for that city. So that often depends on whether you're rehabilitating the structure or if you're going to, if the property owner is, God forbid, planning to demolish the structure and put something in place of it. So there's different criteria in place for every city, and really it's a local matter. It's determined by the local laws in place. And I'm going to turn this over to Betty Marvin to talk about the situation in Oakland.
All right. So you've seen enough examples of local programs to see that there's a family resemblance among them all, especially among the certified local governments who, in effect, follow community standards that are laid down at the federal level for local preservation programs. Distinctive things about Oakland is that it's a bigger city than any of the others we've been talking about. It's got about 100,000 buildings, of which about 70% are pre-1950 or so. So it's an old city, it's a big city. We have about 150 designated city landmarks, which is not very many out of that many older buildings. We have about 350 in a couple of an old and a more recent kind of landmark program, heritage property, and the Landmarks Board's preservation study list. And we have about 1,300 in designated districts. So these are all on the city's GIS. The landmarks and districts are listed on the website, so the second link down, listed designated Oakland landmarks. Designation isn't the whole story. it was mentioned at the beginning that we've got a citywide survey, at least at the windshield level, of absolutely everything, and out of the 100,000 buildings or the 70,000 older buildings, about 25,000 fall within the broadest definition of historic in the preservation element of our general plan. The intent in the element is that a large enough number to really influence the character of our neighborhoods. So if one is asking, is a building historic, which is a question I get all day, every day, the answer is more than just, is it a designated landmark? And on the city's GIS page, there is a parcel by parcel map where when you mouse over, you will get the rating. There are a few false positives where buildings that are not historic come up as local register because there was a miscalculation in how that field was filled in that hasn't been fixed yet, and that brings me some interesting phone calls. But my point here is that designated landmark is important, but it's not the whole story. Part of the reason is that our landmark process is by city council ordinance. So actually the proper name of what's listed as Oakland's Preservation Commission, it's the Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board. It's advisory to the Planning Commission, who then recommends to the city council whether something will be a landmark. So a building or district or other nominated property can be evaluated on its merits at Landmarks Board and still not make it through the political process, typically because of owner objection. So we've developed a lot of workarounds. There was a lot of that happening in the early 1980s, about the time the survey was getting started, about the time the idea of having a preservation element was coming about. And along the line, by the actually not till the late 1980s, we came up with the idea of a local register, picking that term out of CEQA and out of the State Historical Building Code, so that our highest rated buildings, whether they were designated or not, so taking the politics out of the process, the things...
Hi, Betty?
Yeah.
Yeah, Betty, this is John. I just wanted to ask if there was any way you could get closer to the microphone or speak up.
Yeah. Okay, so our local register is the National Register, California Register quality category, regardless of whether they've been designated, either individual buildings or districts. So on the rating system slide, let's bring the rating system slide, the A's and B's or the primary districts. So these are our historic resources for CEQA. These are our historic resources for historical building code. These are the resources that have the strongest demolition protections, the things that'll get the closest look in design review, but these levels of protection and review aren't ruled out for the whole rest of that category of what the element inelegantly calls PDHP, potential designated historic properties. And an important point is under D, minor importance. This is your generic bungalow, for instance, can be within the definition of historic under the element because it's part of a district. So a typical rating would be D, minor importance 2 plus, contributes to a secondary district, or it might be something like D, little c, minor importance as it sits, but if restored would be of secondary importance. And an intent was to recognize neighborhood values and to highlight restoration opportunities. And these are some of our prime candidates for Mills Act. They have to get formal designation to be eligible for the Mills Act. Something has to be a landmark in a designated district or designated a heritage property, that mini landmark status. But if someone comes in with something that's grossly altered, so it's an E little c or E little b, we would welcome them into the Mills Act with a work program to restore it. We also have pretty universal design review for, well, all residential properties, and we're rapidly sneaking up on design review for everything. And in every case, tip-top designated landmark or complete piece of junk, not historic property, we're looking for work that's compatible with any character the building has and with the character of the neighborhood. So in a sense, my contrarian answer to is a building historic is that the prudent thing is to treat anything like a landmark. This draws on the philosophy of the City of Oakland's classic book, Rehab Right, that was published in the late 70s as a city handout for property owners and later was commercially reprinted by 10-Speed Press, and it's on the city website. Once you get to the links that we've got there, you'll find Rehab Right, or you can just search it from the main city page, and this is subtitled How to Realize the Full Value of Your Old House. Starts with a spotter's guide of Oakland house styles from the 1870s right on up to wartime tract house. And when the book first came out, I hardly knew a building from a hole in the ground, but I knew that was a wonderful and democratic thing that they included wartime tract house as something deserving of being rehabbed right.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Betty.
Yeah, and I think my one comment for the real estate community is when you get in trouble is when there's not a good match between the building and the buyer. And historic designation can be an attraction for the right buyer, or it can be a deterrent to someone who's looking for essentially raw land.
Great, thank you very much. And I guess we should move on, just in the interest of time, to move on to the final portion, which William Berg will talk to state and national recognition. And William, you're free to start when you'd like.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and move on to my first slide. I work for the national, I'm just making sure my mic works. I work for California Office of Historic Preservation and in the registration unit, and there are 4 programs that we administer. In addition to the California Register of Historical Resources and the National Register of Historic Places, we also administer the California Historical Landmarks and California Points of Historical Interest program. Those last 2 use a different set of criteria than most of what we're discussing, so I'm going to focus today's discussion on California Register and National Register, and you'll see photos throughout the presentation of different properties throughout the greater Bay Area, including a bit farther south than I think some of you are. I'd like to take a moment to discuss levels of significance. We've been hearing different things about local listing, state listing, national. There are several different programs. There's listing in local registers, there's listing in the California Register, and listing in the National Register. But those are irrespective of what's called the level of significance of the nomination, which means how important was that property within its context. Was it significant primarily to the city or county, or to the entire state where it's located, or was this a property that was influential throughout the entire United States? And there can be locally listed properties that are nationally significant, and the vast majority of properties listed in the National Register, about 90%, are locally significant. Of the remaining 10%, about 9% are at the state level of significance. So only about 1 in 100 National Register properties is nationally significant. I wanted to find one that was kind of unique as an example, and you can see the big Zeppelin on the right. That's the USS Macon. It was essentially an airborne aircraft carrier, and it crashed off the coast of Monterey County. It's an extraordinarily significant vessel in the history of aviation, and it's an archaeological nomination. Probably not something you're going to deal with as a realtor, but that's an example of the kind of property that we'd call nationally significant, not just listed in the National Register. The property on the left is the Palo Alto Medical Clinic. It's primarily a locally significant property. It's significant to the history of Palo Alto and the development of medicine in the East Bay. There's also, the South Bay, and there's also some murals on the inside which are artistically important to the building, but not really to the level of national significance or even state level of significance. But they are all equal in terms of protection and the way they're considered, and what that means essentially is that they're treated as historic resources for purposes of California. They're not, however, limited from private property owner action. That's something that comes from the local government, because local governments have the power to do things like issue building permits, demolition permits, design review, etc. I wanted to compare the California Register and the National Register. The National Register was created in 1966, and it is the program that we work with the most. You can see at the bottom there, last year we reviewed and listed 56 National Register properties. We listed 0 California Register properties last year. We were reviewing 1 in 2014, and I think 2012 we had a particularly banner year for California Register. We added 6 properties. So because the criteria are similar but not exact, there are only certain circumstances where we recommend California Register listing over National Register. There's kind of a perception that California Register listing is easier, but that's not really the case. How it works, just the difference in process. For a California Register nomination, it's required that you submit a copy of the nomination to local government first and then wait 90 days. You send the registered mail receipt and the nomination to our office. We review it, essentially make sure that the nomination is complete, that it makes sense, all the components are there, and then it's scheduled for review by the State Historical Resources Commission. That runs on a 90-day cycle. There's 4 meetings a year. They're publicly noticed. The public has the opportunity to comment. And once it's reviewed by the commission, once it's signed, they vote on it and says, yes, this is eligible, it's immediately listed in the California Register. The difference for National Register is that you can send the nomination directly to our office. It doesn't require review by local government first. It's reviewed by staff. We see if it's complete, if it makes sense. It's reviewed by the commission on that same 90-day cycle. Still a public process. The nominating party is notified when that meeting is going to happen, as well as the owner of the property, the mayor of the local government. If it's a certified local government, if there's a local preservation program, we notify them as well as the County Board of Supervisors. The idea is it's an inclusive public process. After that review, if it's passed by the commission, then the nomination is sent to the keeper, and it's usually about a 45-day wait before we find out whether or not it's been listed. And usually, if it's been sent to the keeper, it will be listed. There are occasionally, very rarely, times when a nomination is returned, but we try to be pretty particular about what we send so we don't get anything back from them saying, sorry, this didn't pass our muster. Roberta talked a little bit about the different criteria, but didn't really identify them. They're lettered in the case of the National Register and numbered in the case of the California Register. Criterion A, or 1, is about events, things that happens in conjunction with this property or at this property. There needs to be a direct connection between the events and the property in order to establish significance. Criterion B, or California Register Criterion 2, is about individuals, people who are important to our history, and the thing that makes them significant has to have a direct association with the property. If, for example, the building is associated with the past mayor of a city, if that city's city hall, where she was the mayor, is still around, then the city hall might be the more appropriate property to nominate in conjunction with her significance as the mayor. But if that city hall isn't around anymore and that building is the last remaining or the most significant remaining property association with that person, then it can be nominated. But if there's not really a connection between that person and what makes them significant, then it's hard to nominate under criterion B. Criterion C is about architecture or design or craftsmanship. It's criterion 3 in California Register. And it can be about the work of master architects, but it isn't strictly necessary to identify the name of the architect. If you can demonstrate that it's the work of a master craftsperson, whether or not you know who it is, it can still be nominated. Essentially, if you are saying it was designed by this architect, it is expected you'll provide documentation to demonstrate that that is so. And if you can identify the architect and their other works and what makes them a master architect, it's easier to make the case than a property that was designed by an anonymous architect and having to have more detail into what makes it significant. Criterion D is about archaeology, subsurface properties, or even properties that are underwater, like the wreck of the Macon that I mentioned earlier. The limitations of listing are that public-funded projects may be subject to review. If you're receiving funds from a government agency and those funds are being used to demolish or damage a potentially historic property, whether or not it's listed, then those funds can be jeopardized unless you can figure out a way to use those funds to restore the property. And local government might treat listed properties as historic properties, but that varies widely by municipality. They might treat property that's listed in the National Register as locally listed, or at the very least treated as a historic property for purposes of CEQA. Private parties can object outright to a nomination. If someone submits a National Register nomination for another person's property and the owner of the property objects, doesn't want it listed, it cannot be listed over their objection. It can be determined eligible, but it can't be listed. That applies for National Register and California Register, although there's one consequence to that I'll get into later. In the case of a district where there are multiple property owners, each property owner gets a vote, and if a majority of property owners object to listing, it cannot be listed over their objection, but if less than a majority object, it can still be listed. Now, if a property is theoretically, it's going to be eligible, it meets the criteria, it has integrity, but the owner objects, it can still be determined eligible. And any property that's listed in the National Register is automatically listed in the California Register. Properties that are determined eligible for the California Register, whether it's through the result of environmental review like Section 106 review or a nomination that the owner objected to, it still results in listing in the California Register. And primarily the purpose of that determination of eligibility is protection from government action, that the government is going to have to treat this as a historic resource for purposes of CEQA, NEPA, Section 106, but in terms of private property owner action, it doesn't really limit what they can do. These are two examples, Century 21 Theater in Santa Clara County and the Chung May Home for Boys in Contra Costa County, that were properties that were determined eligible for listing in the National Register and would have been listed if not for the owner's objection. Some of the previous presenters talked a little bit about historic integrity. Essentially, a property has to be able to convey what makes it significant. Now, what makes it significant varies. In the case of a property that is significant primarily for its architecture, the threshold for integrity is generally higher. If you're saying this building has great architecture and workmanship, that workmanship needs to be demonstrated in what remains there. The material should be original, it should be in its original shape. If it's too far gone, too far decayed, it may no longer retain eligibility. And I use this example, the Bayshore Roundhouse, because you may not be able to tell, but a large portion of this roundhouse, about half of it, was destroyed in a fire. But this is not a high-style architect-designed building. This is a utilitarian working building used as a roundhouse for railroad locomotives. So even though it's in a damaged state, it's still very clear from its surroundings surroundings, from what survives, from what's there, how the building was used. You can comprehend its function by looking at it and walking around the site. You can see the whisker tracks, even the piping for steam to feed a locomotive, to help superheat a locomotive, or the piping for air compressors or to run tools. A lot of that infrastructure is still there, and that helps convey the importance of the property as a working place. And so just because a property is damaged doesn't mean it's not eligible, but there's still a threshold, there's still a standard, and if a property is too far gone, it may no longer be eligible, which brings me to the subject of removal. A property owner can't simply say, I no longer wish to be listed in the National Register or California Register. The only conditions where that removal can happen is either if the property is destroyed or it's damaged to the point where it no longer retains sufficient integrity. This is the Donner Houghton House in Santa Clara County that was destroyed by fire and thus removed after demolition was complete. And the other way you can remove a property is if the nomination is later proven to be inaccurate. If it was nominated based on inaccurate or false information and you can demonstrate whether that was the case, then a property can be removed. But those are really the only conditions that you can remove a property from those registers. In terms of state and federal incentives, some of the other presenters already spoke about the California Historic Building Code. There is also a federal tax credit. This is generally for commercial properties rather than single-family homes, but it does come up in the case of properties that started out as commercial buildings but are converted to residential or to condos. Federal tax credit is generally only for rentals, but one example of a residential property that started out as commercial, the fairly recent tax credit project, is Vallejo City Hall and the Masonic Temple in Solano County. It was obviously a city hall and Masonic Temple, and today they're residential units aimed at young artists and people with limited incomes but with creative backgrounds. And so this kind of property, this kind of project, we're starting to see come up as a potential tax credit project. And if the state tax credit passes, then not only would it be something you can add to a federal tax credit program to add even more of an incentive, but at least the way that the last bill was written, and hopefully a future bill would be, is that you could also use it for single-family homes, and that will really change the game for historic properties and their nominations. And so a realtor who works primarily with historic properties will start to encounter this if it passes. There's also FEMA consideration. Properties listed in the National Register typically get a higher priority for, in the case of natural disasters, and it's obviously something we take seriously in earthquake country, in tsunami country. And so places like Napa, we're definitely looking at some nominations that are coming through that haven't been listed yet, but part of what we're looking for is were these damaged by the earthquake. And then, of course, were properties that were damaged, properties that were already listed. As far as finding out where these properties can be researched, the NPS Focus database, and there will be a link in the last slide of this presentation, is your best resource. It's National Park Service. You can search by name, you can search by state, city, and county. There isn't really a way to search by address, which is kind of a limitation, so it takes a little paging, but especially for smaller cities, the number of National Register listed property is usually pretty small. It can get a little more complex if you're dealing with cities the size of Oakland or San Francisco, that has a lot of National Register properties, but it's mostly, if you're a little methodical about it, or if you have some information to go on, if you suspect a property is listed, it's not too hard to get through. And then there is an information center in Rohnert Park. It's associated with Sonoma State University. Here's the contact information. I assume you'll be able to get this information after the presentation as well. If you want to do a search about a property, find out if it's listed in the California Register as a result of Section 106 review or the result of direct nomination, you can usually find it through the information center pretty reliably, as well as find out other assessments that have been done on the property. Now, a point about property values, there are a lot of myths and rumors about what listing in local registers and the National Register do to property values, and there have also been quite a few studies done on it. And the general assumption is that it has a stabilizing effect on property values. They don't jump as high during real estate booms, but neither do they fall as hard during real estate crashes. So during the recession, places that were historic neighborhoods tended to be a little more resilient to losses in property value, but they didn't go as high as part of the boom. And part of that is the way that historic properties are viewed by different segments of the real estate market. Somebody who's looking for a plot of land and isn't too worried about what's built on top of it is going to be discouraged by the presence of a historic building because they can't just do what they want with the land. But someone who's interested in a building type, that's interested specifically in historic buildings for their aesthetic value or for the potential, is going to be more interested. So what happens is the land underneath the building gets less valuable, but because the property has been formally listed, that's third-party, objective proof that this place is special, it's unique, it's worthwhile, and that raises the value of the building on the land. And that generally these neighborhoods increase in value at a greater rate than other comparable neighborhoods that aren't listed. There's also a recent study done by the National Trust for Historic Preservation called Older, Smaller, Better, and this is particularly worth paying attention to within the context of the Bay Area and many cities that are converting commercials, is finding new roles for their things for their downtowns, and many of them are becoming much more residential. So things like residential lofts in old downtowns, in old commercial buildings, are definitely going to be part of the residential for sale real estate market for the young generation of millennials who are very interested in living in downtowns and living in these kind of cool industrial spaces or these very accessible, very walkable downtown spaces, and not necessarily big city downtowns, but also small town downtown that have charm, that have accessibility, that have connections to regional transit systems. And one of the things the study found, just as kind of an interesting note, is they tracked cell phone calls and where are cell phone signals coming from on Friday nights, on Saturday nights in cities like Seattle and San Francisco. What they found is late at night on the weekends, they're coming from blocks that have lots of old buildings versus blocks that have new buildings, because these older buildings tend to be breeding grounds for more cutting-edge businesses where the risks involved in something like a nightclub or a new restaurant is too high for the investment factors of a new building. But an old building that has a lower margin, those kind of new industries can thrive and creative communities can thrive. So that's part of the real potential of old buildings, and it is going to become more and more of a factor for the residential housing market. But there's also the traditional historic property customer. They're looking for a classic. This is the same sort of person, in other words, who collects classic cars, who wants a Model T, who wants a Mustang, who has money to spend on a place that is beautiful and in a beautiful place. They appreciate historic neighborhoods, they value the aesthetics of the buildings, and also, like those millennials that I mentioned, many of them want to live in a place that's more walkable, and many of the Bay Area's traditional neighborhoods tend to be very walkable, good sidewalks, mature tree growth, and again, walking distance to businesses and to transit. They're also very attractive to fixers and flippers, people who watch a lot of home and garden TV and see people fixing up old homes and turning them around, or they just want to do it as a hobby. And listing has appeal for them, not only because of the potential incentives. In many cases, you can't use the California Historic Building Code unless a property is listed. And if a city doesn't have its own historic preservation program, listing in the National Register, California Register gives you the option. And these are a couple of examples of peninsula properties of this sort. And the kind of customer that they can attract is a particular one. It's not the same sort of customer who wants to do a tear down and build a McMansion. It's a particular customer. If you have historic properties in your portfolio or in your market, these are the kind of properties you're going to want to show to someone who's looking for a place that has charm, that has accessibility, that has that established neighborhood value. They're not for everyone, but for this historic property customer, nothing else will do. These are some useful links. I'm sorry, the City of Rockford study link URL there is a little lengthy, but it also has the other links I mentioned and my contact information. If you have any other questions about National Register or California Register nomination, please feel free to contact me. And thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, William. That's perfect timing. So we have about 15 minutes for question and answers. If anybody has any questions, now is your time. We still have 3 of the speakers present, including myself, so or as well as myself. So click on the raise your hand symbol, or you can also type in your question in the chat box. I'm going to wait around here just for a second just to see if any questions come in. I know we covered a lot of information today. We tried to breeze through a lot of information, but I'm sure you'll find the links that I send you by the end of today especially helpful. There will be maps. I'll include these links that William has included, and also anything else that was presented, in addition to a PDF copy of the entire presentation. So what I'm looking at the chat box right now. I don't see any questions come in. But if you have them, now is your last chance. And I don't see anybody raising their hands. So it seems like, oh, I see one question coming in. So we'll wait until that's in. Still waiting on this question. Gina, if you're still typing your question in, we're oh, here it is. Oh, it's a comment actually. And so she's asking if she should always log in as a guest. So this is for everybody's information. You're welcome to log in as a guest. All you have to do is type in your full name so we can confirm that you're present. If you have trouble logging in, it's possibly because you may not have the password, but we have a list of everybody's passwords. So all you have to do is email me and ask for the password. You'll need that password also to take your quiz if you miss any sessions. And if you had the password, I can troubleshoot it for you, and I'll try to log in with your name to see if it works. But my guess is it's possible that you may have the wrong password, or I'll figure it out for you. So in any case, if you have problems logging in, you always have the option of joining as a guest. Just type in your whole name. So if, I think we have 2 other possible questions. Jeffrey wants to know about the quiz. So Jeffrey, if anybody present is unable to attend any of the sessions, whether it's part 2 or 3 or 4, what you do is you receive the recording for this session, and you watch the recording, and you take a 10-question quiz. You're not required to take the quiz if you're present for the live session, but you are required to take the quiz if you're present, or if you're not present for the session and you have to watch the recording. So for the people that have scheduling issues for the Wednesdays, or they can't make a certain day, there's always the option of watching the recording and then taking the 10-question quiz. You have to pass the quiz with 70% completion rate. You have 4 or 6 chances to complete the quiz with that grade, and you will proceed on to the next session if you complete 70%. And if you logged in late, it depends on how late you are. So if you're more than 15 minutes late, you might need to take the quiz, and I usually confirm that by hand by looking at the logs. So I will let you know if you're not marked as present. James has a question for our speakers, and he wants to know how can and how does sustainability play a role in considering older development over newer development?
I could respond to it if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, I just typed, so the greenest building is one that's already built. It's kind of a truism in the preservation community, and that's for several reasons. First of all is that the energy investment of building a building is worth decades of its actual energy consumption while the building is in use. And so the embodied energy value of that building is worth taking into consideration, as is waste material from construction by new buildings. About half the contents of our landfills are either demolished bits of old buildings or the waste materials from new construction. And there is a pretty advanced science these days of how to rehab existing buildings, and that Rehab Right booklet that Oakland produced, and also Retrofit Right, which is a companion volume to it, really were just the beginning, but they give a lot of advice on the relatively simple and very often very cost-effective ways to reduce losses of energy and to increase energy efficiency of an older home without losing the historic appearance.
Great. That's a good to mention, and thanks for mentioning that, William, is the embodied energy of a building always means that the greenest building is the one that's already present. So a lot of the calculations do take into account the waste materials and also the new construction materials. And it looks like Jeffrey is asking about the dates, and I apologize, but it's not 11/18 for the third part of the session, it's 11/19, which is a Wednesday. So just so everybody knows, that date will be changed on the calendar, but it should be 11/19 Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. for part 3. Part 2 is up next, and that will be November 5th, Wednesday, November 5th. Caitlin Harvey will be speaking along with possibly another speaker on architectural styles in the Bay Area. We'll have a sort of a quick fun quiz. It's not a graded quiz, but just to gauge people's knowledge of architectural styles. We'll show some pictures and possibly quiz you on what you think that style is. So if there are no further questions, I don't think I see any further questions other than possibly one from James coming in. We'll have about 7 minutes if we need to address any further questions. But if there are no further questions, I'm going to move on to the evaluation. Please do let us know how this session went today. This allows us to improve our programs. On the right-hand side, you'll find some links to the downloads for today's presentation, and also a link to the National Register database that William mentioned. On the bottom of the screen, there are spots for written responses, so if you have any written comments or anything, we would love to hear them. When you complete this multiple choice evaluation, please scroll up to the top of the page and click on the Submit Response button. That way we are sure that we've received your feedback. And I look forward to joining with you on the 5th of November. You are now 1/4 of the way through the program, so congratulations. And once you complete all 4 sessions, we'll be issuing you a certificate online. Pretty much happens automatically as soon as you are marked complete for each of the 4 sessions. I wanted to send words of thanks to each of our speakers today, Roberta, Betty, William, and Caitlin. Thank you all for your support of the foundation, and by registering with this program, you're supporting a nonprofit foundation that advocates for the protection of historic places in the state. So we appreciate your support, and look forward to working with you in the coming 1.5 months to complete the program. Don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions about it at any time. Thanks again, everybody.